which is the global climate summit and talks which are taking place right now and started officially on Monday. And it's really appropriate because at the heart of climate policy is internationalism, and at the heart of international policy is climate. And as a Labour movement, this is something which we really need to put in the heart of our own policy. So I just want to say a few things, particularly about the COP. And sorry, I've just realised that typically I've not introduced myself, and I'm Sam Mason. So I'm a member of Labour CND. I also happen to be a climate change activist and a policy officer. I work for PCS Trade Union covering sustainability and climate change, and have always been proud that our union is opposed to nuclear weapons and nuclear power as well, and the two are inextricably linked. So I just want to say more of a Labour CND hat on. However, just a bit about where we are with the climate talks and the significance of the discussion tonight in relation to the events taking place in Glasgow. I think the first thing is that the expectations for Glasgow, as somebody have put it, if they were low to start with, then you need to lower your expectations even more about what will come out, because the rhetoric of the Johnson government and the Bidens and everybody else will not match up to the action which we need to happen in terms of the measures to address climate change in any serious way. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift around all this discussion around net zero by 2050 is actually too late for the action needed. But I wanted to highlight one thing particularly, and I don't know if others have actually picked this up, in how Boris Johnson has been presenting his contribution to the climate talks so far in his speech yesterday, that he's used this metaphor of being, 1 minute before midnight. And I think it's quite ironic that he's chosen that as a metaphor on climate change, because this is obviously relates to the doomsday clock, and the doomsday clock obviously looks at global risks, and one of the other global risks around that is, of course, the threat of nuclear weapons, and what's happening geopolitically around that, which other speakers will come to in their contributions, I'm sure. The other thing that won't get discussed at the COP climate talks is the role of the military and the military carbon blueprint, as we're beginning to call it. These don't get accounted for in carbon accounting, and this very much sits outside, and it's quite difficult to know exactly what should be included in there. But of course, the whole idea of nuclear weapons is very central to a lot of this discussion for a number of reasons. One, because obviously just producing and operating nuclear weapons and everything around that has a whole carbon and climate impact. Obviously, if they were ever used, it would have the most devastating climate impact as well, with nuclear winters and the whole environmental degradation that was caused. There's also obviously the current uranium mining, whether that's for weapons or nuclear power sector as well, also has enormous environmental impact. And of course, many of these impacts are felt by those in the global south and Indigenous communities in Australia, for example, amongst other reasons. So there's lots of reasons why we need to consider this within the framing of climate change, but also the vast sums of money that are being spent on, for example, the UK nuclear deterrent is money that could actually be invested into the kind of actions that we need, public interventions to tackle the climate crisis. And if you think that the TEC has put out around a number of, I think it's about 68 billion that would be needed a year to invest in jobs, for example, within a new green economy, there's very much better things we could be doing with that money, not just for, clearly for the sake of humanity, and also creating the kind of peaceful future that we need. So what we really need to be investing in is a peace economy, not the kind of economy where we've seen in the budget just last week an increase in military expenditure, for example. So these kind of discussions are really critical within the climate talks, but we won't hear very much about them. And what they will focus on is market mechanisms and not real solutions that will actually protect people in the longer term. So I won't go on more about that, but I think it was just to give a flavour about when we listen to these discussions in the next couple of weeks, is really to try and get a sense of where this fits within the whole sort of paradigm of those discussions and the geopolitical situation as well, and what we really need to be investing in globally, and this whole agenda for peace if we really want a deal on climate for everybody. So I'm going to move to our first speaker, which is, sorry, I'm just trying to find it on my list, which is Jess Barnard, who I mentioned is chair of Young Labour. So Jess, so it's right that we hear from Jess very early on. Jess became chair of Young Labour in 2020 and previously sat on the Young Labour National Committee as the Eastern Rep since 2016. And she previously stood as parliamentary candidate in Broadland in 2019 and was a Norfolk County Councillor. So very pleased to hand over to you, Jess. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to have to take you to every event I go to. So yeah, thank you to the organisers and thanks for the invitation. And organising what is such an important event. And I'm really thrilled to see the Labour CND movement reacting to and organising around such an important time. And obviously you've touched on Young Labour's action recently at National Party conference. So to set the scene, I guess, unless you've been living under a rock, you'd probably be aware that this year, particularly in response to the actions this year, brutal colonial oppression of the Palestinian people by Israel, young people here in the UK in their hundreds of thousands took to the streets to demand freedom for the Palestinian people. And that was an incredible movement, an act of solidarity and international solidarity, which is in the face of and despite the best efforts of the Conservatives, have suffocated young people with years of an ideology that says we should base everything on individualism, that we should kind of be divided and we should pull up the ladder behind us. That's been instilled in us from education into the workplaces in every aspect of life, but it's been overwhelmingly rejected by young people who can see very clearly that the struggles of our siblings internationally are our struggles too, and that we stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We can't turn the other cheek to human rights abuses, and our solidarity does extend across the world. And so to those who say we should look at domestic issues first, I think it's really important we take lead from young people who see the importance of international solidarity. And that's exactly why Young Labour this year decided to move our priority motion to conference and call for sanctions on Israel. And we were absolutely overwhelmed with the support and the enthusiasm from people across the Labour movement who were able to get that passed as Labour policy. But we aren't going to stop there. We are committed to building on this. It is a huge step forward in building this international solidarity and standing for human rights. And we're already taking steps to build that support among our youth sister parties across the globe, because we all collectively recognise that we can't wait for world leaders to take this action. And while we hope for action this week in Scotland, we won't be holding our breath from world leaders. So obviously we need to talk about nuclear disarmament, and I think we acknowledge that international solidarity and nuclear disarmament have to go hand in hand, particularly when you acknowledge the history of nuclear weapons and the impact on Indigenous peoples, communities, and of course the lives lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the continued impact it has on the lives of citizens around the world. And of course here, because while we spend billions upon billions on nuclear weapons and flexing our muscles at China or developing countries who we determine are somehow a threat to our economic authority, we are abandoning the real threats that are on our hands, and that is the climate crisis, the erosion of human rights across the globe, and the disastrous impacts of capitalism on the free market. And it's a really disgusting reality that we condemn millions of children in our own country to poverty while we throw finances at war and the threat of destruction at other people in other countries. But importantly, and I guess something that gives us hope, is that we're completely not alone or outriders on this issue. 83% of Labour voters, I think it was in January this was polled, support nuclear weapons bans, and 59% of the general public support moves to ban nuclear weapons. So this is a mainstream issue. We have the overwhelming support of the public with us, but the lack of political will is the barrier, the lack of ambition or understanding by our country's leaders. This is something that people stand for. So I'll end with, the question for us, and the thing we've got to overcome is, to our government, to Labour parliamentarians who have been too silent on this issue for too long, and who've not yet supported the call for nuclear disarmament, is, do you see our future as harping back to days of arms races, of terror, of colonialism, of exploitation, and condemning our future generations to climate collapse, which goes hand in hand with nuclear weapons? Or are we going to build a new kind of international politics that is based on peace, on justice, on meaningful, sustainable jobs, and of course, on ensuring the future of our planet? That's the question in the hands of the world leaders. That's the question in the hands of our party. And that's something that Young Labour is fighting for.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Jess. And I think, that's a really important question to put out there, and, to really get responses to that in a genuine way and to start a genuine discussion. I'm now going to move over to Shelly Asquith. So Shelly's from the Stop the War Coalition. Labour has always worked with organisations working for peace and against war. And since 2001, CND has had a pivotal working relationship with Stop the War Coalition. Previous chairs of Stop the War include the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, and former London Assembly member, Murad Qureshi. The current chair is a well-known activist in the Labour Party. And Shelly, we're delighted to have you join us this evening. So over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. It's really brilliant to join this meeting tonight, and particularly to hear from Jess just then, who I think is an inspiring chair of Young Labour. And I'm especially so encouraged by how much of an internationalist position her and comrades in Young Labour have taken in support of Palestine and the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement at a time when, and in an environment where it's not always easy to do so, but it has always been and will remain absolutely right. And it's fantastic as well that Young Labour is part of this fight for a nuclear-free future. And thanks to you, Sam, as well, for giving that excellent introduction, contextualising how, as world leaders come together for COP in Glasgow, all eyes are on the climate emergency. And I wanted to focus my contribution tonight on that very topic as well, and build on your remarks. For our generation, as young or youngish, in my case, Labour members, we recognise impending climate catastrophe as the biggest threat to human life. For our parents' generation, it was the threat of nuclear warfare. And as Sam said, nowhere on the agenda at COP is how these two dangers are linked: war and climate change. Because globally, one of the biggest causes of climate chaos is war. Both world wars and the atomic bomb caused environmental damage like never seen before. And yet since then, we've only seen militarism grow. The United States military alone, were itself a country, would be the 55th largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. Going to war and preparing to go to war is the single largest use of energy in the United States. And how about over here? In Britain, the Ministry of Defence is the largest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions within the central government. And a report by Declassified estimates the annual carbon footprint of our military is equal to 6 million cars. And Britain's military emissions alone total around half of all of the EU countries combined. BAE Systems, who of course in 2016 began work on the new Trident submarines, contributes around 30% of the total emissions for Britain's arms industry as a whole. One might take the government at its word of becoming more carbon efficient and think that that might mean a reduction in warfare. But in the last year, we've seen the biggest increase in military spending in more than 30 years. We have seen the deployment of the largest ever naval vessel ever constructed, an incredibly high energy consuming vehicle at that, in the shape of the HMS Queen Elizabeth in the Carrier Strike Group, stoking tensions in the South China Sea. Warfare, whether it's nuclear and other weapons, the training of armies and navies, the deployment of militaries and military-produced contaminants as well, has had a hugely negative effect on our environment. It pollutes our water, our land and air. It causes the decline of biodiversity and ecosystems worldwide. The US-UK war in Afghanistan caused widespread deforestation in that country. It emitted millions of tons of CO2 into the air, not to mention the lethal chemicals and toxic munitions that cause high rates of cancer and other fatal illnesses amongst Afghans. Just one aspect of Britain's shameful legacy in that country. And yet the world's military has been exempt from scrutiny, as you said, Sam, because of this corrupt web of corporations and governments that profit from militarism, whether politically or financially. Last year, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade released a report on military spending and climate change, and it showed that the British government spends more than twice as much on the military compared to what it spends on preventing climate change. So it's no coincidence that the countries with the largest industrialised militaries have the largest carbon footprints, making them the biggest polluters on the planet. And it's clear that if we are to really champion this issue, and if Labour has any hope in the future of securing power, it's clear that it must. We must be drawing the link between destructive warfare and the destruction of life. Not only the many lives that are damaged through deaths in direct conflict, through bombing campaigns, or through economic sanctions, and of course being the biggest drive of refugees, but also on the lives that it damages in the long term through flooding, through forest fires, toxic air. The Labour Party, I think, has come a long way in the last 6 years on the issues of anti-austerity and climate justice, but we still have a long way to go on anti-imperialism and the fight for a peaceful future. The end of the war in Afghanistan is certainly not the end of Britain at war. It has merely been a moving of military interests. Britain is now the biggest supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia, being used in a devastating war on Yemen. Britain is investing $16.5 billion in defence, the largest spending boost in a generation. And the Carrier Strike Group mission to the Indo-Pacific represented the biggest Navy mobilisation since the Falklands, with the first battle fleet in Asia since the Korean War in the 50s. These issues barely make the news, and it's no surprise that most people weren't aware that we were still occupying Afghanistan 20 years later until we started to leave. So I urge everyone here to join Stop the War's mailing list to stay informed. That's the main reason you can, away from the mainstream media, but to find out also what we're doing to organise opposition to war and militarism. And if you'd like to be more involved, of course, become a member of Stop the War as well. We can't rely on the world leaders at COP. It's up to us to organise, mobilise and fight for our future. And it's young Labour members, it's CND members, Stop the War members who make up the front line of that fight. And it's our task to continue raising these arguments and winning people to our cause. So comrades, thank you for having me here tonight. I look forward to standing with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. That's fantastic, and very much remember being part of those early demonstrations with Stop the War when we had millions on the streets, and we need millions on the streets again for the fight against climate change. And just to flag as well that, of course, we've got the Global Day of Action coming up on Saturday, this Saturday, 6th of November. There've been mass mobilisations across the country. Clearly, there's the flagship demonstration in Glasgow, but London will be another one of the where we're hoping to see the largest of the demonstrations, and there will be a peace block on that demonstration. So if you're in London, do come along and join the peace blocks. And there's also a lot happening in Scotland as well. And just on a personal note, I'm really pleased to be part of several groups that we've actually managed to get this much more on the agenda of the civil society spaces around the COP, around the links between climate change and anti-militarism as well. So there's quite a bit going along on this and to build on. So I'm next going to come to our next speaker, which is Ronan Burtenshaw, who became the editor of Tribune in 2018 and has grown it into one of the most successful journals on the Labour left with 20,000 subscribers. So over to you, Ronan.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thanks to Labour CND for inviting me along to speak at this meeting tonight. It's fantastic as an editor of Tribune to be able to work with CND in all of its various forms, of course. There have been CND articles in both of our last two print issues, and there will be in issues going forward, but our connection goes much further back than that. In particular, I want to pay some tribute to the role that Michael Foot played in the establishment as one of the founders of CND, and also one of the key figures in developing Tribune over so many decades. He was involved in that first meeting that founded CND back in February 1958, and also as Labour leader took the bold decision to include in the 1983 manifesto the unilateral nuclear disarmament in Britain, something which is an aspiration that all of us on the left in this country must have today, many, many years after that. And I think it is something that bears tribute at a meeting like this. So, I mean, one of the things that strikes me as interesting always when I think of what our role in left media is in relation to these questions, it can often seem like a pretty Sisyphean task, to be honest, doing left media, because you are trying to build something which competes with these enormous millionaire and billionaire owned empires and the extraordinary power they have to project the interests of the powerful across society. But nothing ever convinced me more of the need to have some kind of alternative in the media than the spectacle that we were subjected to both in the 2019 general election and then the Labour leadership campaign itself, of a media determined to make the question of whether you were prepared to press the nuclear button a contingency, a factor, in fact more than a factor, a key of legitimacy for anyone to become a political leader of substance in this country. What they were saying, in other words, is if you were not prepared as a political leader to decide in an instant to incinerate millions of people, then you couldn't be taken seriously, you couldn't be trusted with the hands of power, and that people shouldn't vote for you. And it is no surprise, to be honest, that we have the kind of government that we do, which shows such lack of care for its own people, or that we live in a world which is so characterized, so blighted by war, when the media system that we have considers that to be a key issue of legitimacy for whether or not people should be political leaders. That, to me, is the greatest argument you're going to have for trying to do something different in the media. And it is related very directly to the question of nuclear weapons. They will, of course, tell us when they ask questions like that this is about necessity. It's the same argument that they made in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, the same argument they made when 50,000 people died in Nagasaki and 100,000 and more died in Hiroshima, that these things were necessary, that they were necessary for our security, that they are necessary to maintain the peace, that we just had to murder on a massive scale thousands and thousands of innocent people in a single moment and blight entire communities and parts of the world for decades and generations to come, with horrible injuries and illnesses because of the necessity for security. That argument that was built on a lie in the Second World War, built around the lie that we needed to drop nuclear weapons rather than our leaders, political leaders, and the political leaders in the United States particularly wanted to drop those weapons to prove the newfound power that they had to the rest of the world. That lie has continued to legitimate the existence of these abominations for decades afterwards. And today's nuclear weapons, I think it's very important that we put this into the context that it deserves. Today's nuclear weapons are 3,000 times stronger than the nuclear weapons dropped on Hiroshima that killed 100,000 people. And we don't only have one of them or 10 of them or 100 of them, but there are thousands of them. 5,000 warheads and more in the United States, probably more than that in Russia. And these weapons, it wouldn't take even a fraction of those numbers of thousands to wipe out the entire population of the planet that we live on. And it is, I think, very important that we treat the statements of world leaders as they assemble at their farce in COP26 in Glasgow on the question of saving the planet, that we treat those kind of commitments, their commitments to the planet and the necessity to save our future, with the context that none of them have been prepared to take any meaningful steps towards disarming the very weapons that in a heartbeat could destroy life on this planet in general. And the title of this meeting is No Future in Nukes. I think it's very true. I think that's something that isn't just a slogan or a phrase. The nuclear arms race literally robbed the people of this planet of their future. We fought for centuries to break the absolute power of kings, only for the Second World War to hand the power of a god to political leaders in the most powerful countries in the world. These political leaders, as we've said, are up and making their sermons at COP26. But as long as those political leaders hold in their hands at any given moment the ability to obliterate human life on this planet, we will never truly have something that looks like freedom. Those decisions will never be can never be subject to democratic oversight or democratic power. And as long as they exist, everything that we build can be wiped out by the decisions made by a handful of political elites miles away from where we live and from any chance of our impact on the decision making. They will say, that this is a question of security. As Comrade Christy Moore once wrote, it isn't. It's a question of suicide. It's a question of the ability of the people of this planet to assert their right to continue our existence against a political elite that is determined over and over again in total defiance of the popular opinion that is expressed in polls in country after country across the planet, the popular opinion that's expressed in the United Nations through the endorsement of treaties which say that nuclear weapons should be illegal. They insist on their right to maintain these abominations and their right, therefore, to kill every one of us in a war should it come about. I don't accept that is our only path forward. I don't accept that the only way to do diplomacy is through gunboats at the point of a nuclear weapon. I don't believe that the only means of human interaction is mutually assured destruction. I think we can build another kind of mutuality on this planet, one based on cooperation and the common interest. I think if you agree with those principles, you should get involved with Labour CND and CND more generally and fight this fight, because it is the fundamental fight when it comes to our ability to live on this planet as free individuals, as communities that are empowered and in any kind of democratic sense. So thanks to Labour CND for the invite tonight, and to the other speakers. Thanks to Sam for hosting, and get involved where you can.
Thanks very much, Ronan. I think we was just going to hand over to Daniel now to take over from here.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Daniel. I'm also on the executive of Labour CND, and I'm just going to come in at this point with an important mention that this meeting was organised with funding from a donation in memory of Walter Wolfgang. Walter Wolfgang was a founding member of CND and an organiser of the first Aldermaston March. Since the formation of Labour CND as a specialist section in CND, he was central to its activity for decades, and in 2006 was elected to Labour's National Executive Committee. He died in 2019, still a member of the Labour CND executive in his 90s. He was always enthusiastic about younger members, and therefore it is very fitting that the event has been supported by funding in his memory. I'm going to jump in now and introduce our next speaker, who is Gemma Bolton. Gemma has been on Labour's National Executive for a year. Prior to that, she was a parliamentary candidate in the 2019 general election. She's a co-chair of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, and it's a key aspect of the work in this area, understanding the structures of the party in relation to policy making. Of course, as an NEC member, Gemma, like all members of the NEC, is automatically a member of Labour's National Policy Forum too, and was also a great speaker at our Labour CND's conference earlier in the year. So we're delighted that she's back. So Gemma, over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. What a lovely tribute to an incredible man, Wolfgang. And as Daniel said a little while ago, when the Labour CND conference happened, I was really kindly invited to speak at one of the events. And what I realised as quite a young woman, despite always being opposed to nuclear weapons in the abstract, I hadn't actually spent much time thinking about what a terrifying prospect they represent to the planet. And I sat down beforehand, I'm going to read more articles, I'm going to think about what I say and what I do before I go to this event. And I found a report by the International Committee of the Red Cross that was released in January 2020. And it asked a sample of millennials to rank 12 global issues in order of importance. And in that ranking, the majority had placed nuclear weapons last. And it raises this question as to why this topic appears to be eclipsed by so many other issues. Because pandemic aside, there's nuclear catastrophe and climate catastrophe, and they're the two biggest issues that are facing the world. And the majority of young people are in favour of nuclear disarmament. But whilst younger populations are being driven to the streets in their thousands to protest the issue of climate change, they no longer seem to be driven to do the same for nuclear disarmament. And as young people, we have to refocus on the threat of nuclear weapons and push the issue up the agenda and promote serious change in global leadership attitudes to weapons of mass destruction. And I think for many under the age of around 30, nuclear weapons have this aura of being a historic issue, an issue of the past. It's of the 60s, of the 80s, or even of the early noughties. And unlike previous generations, I don't think we have a real experience of the direct and present threat or the fear of nuclear attack. And nuclear weapons still exist, and they're still a very present threat. And nuclear war is still a very present threat. And but I think for young people, they really exist in the abstract, in movies, in games, in our history lessons. And in a changing world, our focus has moved, and it's largely shifted onto the climate crisis and healthcare and housing, issues that we have that direct experience over, and which we feel we have more agency over. And there are, of course, many incredible young activists who are committed to a world of peace, free from nuclear weapons, but still the topic does gain less publicity, and modern day young anti-nuclear activists just aren't given the same platform as young environmental activists. And I think that a major issue here is a lack of education, a modern education on nuclear weapons. And what study there is in school always presents it as something in the history curriculum. It's a past issue, it's not real, it's not current threat. And we're taught very little of the current global situation, the risks and threats that are very present globally today. It's such a complex issue that does need to be picked within our education curriculum and needs to be given due time to be studied and to create that present threat. I think without that necessary context, how can young people fully understand, how can we comprehend the dangers of this issue? And we see the direct consequences of racism, environmental destruction, homelessness, poverty every single day in our lives. And these issues occupy our generation because these are the things which we are directly confronted by. And I think it truly hammers home the overwhelming importance of campaigns like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the work it does to educate and to inform and to fight for nuclear disarmament. Because we need to mainstream the issue of nuclear disarmament once more into the minds of young people and new generations. And I think this can be done by illustrating that actually there is really clear, it's tangible together. So if we care about the environment, how can we call ourselves an environmentalist and not recognise, for example, the dangers that nuclear weapons would pose to our natural world? And how can we say we care about economic justice and not understand the effects that nuclear catastrophe would have to the least powerful in our society? And to say that the threat of nuclear war then is woven so intrinsically through so many of the crises that we fight and the issues that we confront and fight on every day. And I think as younger people, we have to be more aware of that. And also of the enormity of the sums of money that we're talking about when we discuss nuclear weapons and we discuss Trident and nuclear disarmament. The direct impacts on public finances of the entire coronavirus pandemic measures for this year alone is expected to be just over 200 billion. And the government's claiming, more austerity to cover it. And yet the cost of renewing Trident is over 200 billion. 205 billion, and no one really mentions this or compares them side by side as what a ridiculous amount of money that actually is, and how many social issues we could resolve overnight with that amount of with that sort of money, if it was redirected into our healthcare, if it was redirected into the environment, to public services, into our housing that's crumbling apart at the moment. And then to move on to the Labour Party, we have this huge block of young people, almost 100,000 young members in the Labour Party, and they don't need much convincing in this regard. They don't need to be really told to oppose nuclear weapons, because in the majority, overwhelming majority, they do. And Labour-list polling shows that, because renewing Trident was the party's least popular policy among members in the 2019 manifesto. So being pro-war and being pro-nuclear weapons really is no way to win over the support of young people, and their attraction to the Labour Party is, and I think which will be, in spite of it, what attraction there still is to the Labour Party, will be in spite of it and not because of it. Because young people were attracted to the Labour Party under, for example, Jeremy's leadership, and this was because he was opposed, in no small way, he was opposed to wars, and his focus on peace in comparison to, for example, the recent Blair years. And if we return to this strong on defence line, or even like a hint of a return to a party in which warmongers just use their roles to in government to support foreign wars, we see another Cold War, you'll see young people just turn their back on Labour. So many members turn their back on Blair once he became even more of a warmonger. And the future of the party, I think, lies in harnessing that enthusiasm of the last few years, that eagerness for a more peaceful, for a more equal, more just society. We need to harness that energy and turn that towards the Labour Party, so that it hears loud and clear that the future we want is nuclear weapons free, is a future of peace, and that there's no way to a Labour government for a modern generation through nuclear weapons and keeping Trident. So we need to keep the issue of peace high on the Labour Party agenda, and send the great motions that are drafted by Labour CND to any C3 or local CLPs, ask Labour CND for speakers at local meetings, and keep our Labour activity linked into the protest movement wherever we can and wherever those opportunities arise. And we need to remind the Labour Party leadership that the vast majority of members, and young members in particular, are anti-nuclear weapons and for a more peace, just world, and not let the issue get relegated to the back burner, and say that it's still a very present issue that we want to talk about and we want to fight on. So to summarise and finish up quickly, young people are overwhelmingly in favour of nuclear disarmament, and so we need to fight more on the issue, and we need to hammer home the close links between the other issues that we're fighting for and nuclear disarmament, and just further harness the willingness of our young Labour Party members to do this. And in this, CND and Labour CND, of course, in particular, are doing really excellent work. The rest of us in the Labour Party, we just have to amplify any way we can. So thank you for having me tonight, and it's this really great event. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else.
Thanks very much, Gemma. That was great. And on that last point about working with others and taking things forward, I'm just going to mention that this event was co-hosted with technical expertise from Arise Festival, Labour's Left's Ideas. Arise does great work raising issues of internationalism, peace and justice within the Labour Party. And now Sam Browse is going to tell us a bit more about Arise. Sam.
Hello, comrades, and good evening. I hope you're okay. Yeah, so as Daniel said, the meeting tonight is hosted by Arise Festival. Thank you so much for coming. Arise is a festival of left ideas. We regularly talk about British foreign policy. We regularly host international speakers to talk about those issues, and I'll talk about an event we're running in a bit. But I would first of all implore you for kind of updates on future events. Please follow us on social media. So we've got a Twitter page and a Facebook page, and both those things will be posted in the chat below. So yeah, please follow us on social media. The other thing I'd say too is just a quick plug for our own media partner, which is Labour Outlook. Labour Outlook is a news and views site of the Labour left. It's got lots of analysis on there, lots of reports from campaigns and trade union activism and everything. So it's a real source of information, source of analysis. And again, we regularly feature kind of comment for international writers as well as MPs and trade union leaders as well. So do check out Labour Outlook. I mentioned earlier on an event. Our next Arise hosted event is in partnership with the Labour Assembly Against Austerity. It's called Resisting the Tory Offensive, Winning an Agenda for People and Planet. And it's on Saturday, the 27th of November. And you can register, hopefully in the link that's posted below. And actually what might be particularly interesting for some of you, look at that, boom, as if by magic, posted in the chat below. A particular event that you might find interesting, especially given that you're here today, is our meeting with Jeremy Corbyn, Belle Rivera Addy, and Mark Weisbrot from the Centre for Economic and Policy Research. There's more speakers to be announced. That's called On the Brink of Catastrophe for a Socialist Internationalism to End War, Global Injustice and Climate Chaos. It'd be absolutely fantastic to see you there. So get registered for that, and hopefully see you at the end of the month. And yeah, and get signed up to social media and get plugged into the conversation. And thanks so much for tuning in today as well. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks. We have got hundreds of people watching this, either in the Zoom webinar where people are asking questions, or on Facebook Live, or on YouTube. And I understand people have been saying they are from all over the country, Colwyn Bay, Littleborough, Nottingham, North Tyneside. I'm going to offend someone by not mentioning them, but we've got loads. We've also got two more speakers, and I may have people cutting across me because they may arrive. These are two MPs who I think are voting in Parliament at the moment. They've been in touch either just at the beginning or just before the meeting. They haven't forgotten us, but they are voting in Parliament. They're not yet with us. So I'm going to take a couple of questions, but then I might interrupt our current speakers to bring in our MPs who are hopefully going to arrive shortly. We are aiming to finish at 7:30, so they won't have long to address you, but they haven't told us they're not coming. The last thing they said, they are just dealing with votes in Parliament. So I don't know if any of our speakers feel comfortable addressing this. Jess mentioned in her contribution the support for nuclear disarmament amongst Labour Party supporters and the population in general. Given this, what can our speakers say about the attitude of the PLP? Maybe it's best answered, or maybe they wouldn't want to answer, by the speakers who aren't here. But would any of our panellists who are here, who maybe haven't got to be so careful about what they say about colleagues, like to come in on that question? Looking for hands in the air. People are a bit shy. Gemma.
I think it's since no one's saying anything, I'll fill the gap. I just think we have a fundamental issue with the PLP and a juxtaposition between the current PLP and the membership of the party and the views of the membership of the party, and that's something that we have to continue to fight for if we want to be active, engaged Labour Party members. And we have to be continuing to fight in our constituencies as well as at other levels in the party to wrangle that control back to the members, and that includes to the winning members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, because when we have those voices and they're amplified and they're talking about disarmament or peace or the environment or whatever they're fighting on, it rallies people to a socialist cause, a more peaceful cause. So I think that's just an argument for continuing to fight, because I think that it's a shame that we have so few members of our PLP who will stand up and fight against things like nuclear weapons and will not fight against warmongering. And we have to continue to amplify and find voices and bring those voices to Parliament who do.
Thanks. And Jess, you were mentioned in the question. I think you're going to come in with something.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Hard to follow. Gemma has covered quite a lot of what I was going to say, but I think it's just important to acknowledge our politics doesn't come from the PLP. We elect the people who represent us in Parliament. They are in that position because of us as members, and we should always remember that we still have that power to, as to who we elect to represent us. And it maybe feels extremely difficult at the moment when so many of the PLP are quite hostile to so much of the membership, but so much of the membership are really passionate about nuclear disarmament. And so we need to ensure that we use that leverage that we have. The majority of Labour members do not want our country to have nuclear weapons. And so it's their job to represent us, and we need to be reminding them of that. We were really spoiled in a way with having Jeremy Corbyn as leader for so long. And I think particularly this is quite a difficult time for people who joined under Jeremy, and so who maybe didn't experience what it was like before, when you had to constantly lobby Labour leaders to adopt any kind of position that might be against the status quo. And so we have to find the strength, the determination, and a way to build collective power again to ensure that we can push our representatives to adopt those positions, because unfortunately most Westminster politicians aren't like Jeremy. They aren't in touch with grassroots movements, they aren't in touch with campaigns for human rights, and so we are the ones that have got to make that happen. And so we've got to stay in the party, stay determined, and keep pushing for that.
Thanks. And Shelly is now going to come in as well. Shelly.
Yeah, I don't mind. I just want to address something that I think is sometimes a bit of an elephant in the room in these discussions, because then you've got to be clear about the other massive stakeholder in our party, which is the unions, that have significant influence on the PLP, and rightly so. And it's really important that in this debate we bring union members with us. There was a really interesting map going around on Twitter last week that showed different parts of Britain and union membership in each sort of local authority area. And the area with the highest level of union density at over 50% was Copeland, where they build nuclear reactors, among other things, at Rolls-Royce factories. And there are huge numbers of jobs in the defence industry. And I think some of this rhetoric around there's no jobs on a dead planet isn't particularly helpful in trying to win union members over to our arguments. I think if you want to bring people with you, if you want to bring working class people with you who aren't necessarily part of the movement, you've got to talk about sustainable alternatives, about investing in good green jobs in the communities that need them, in education and training, rather than kind of demonising and playing into this idea that you've got working class people on one hand and the sort of middle class hippies that talk about peace on the other. Actually, our interests are so aligned. And I think if we're talking about a future PLP that is with us and that is pro-peace, then the unions are kind of a significant factor in that.
Thanks, Shelley. Really great comments. And of course, we can note that at Labour Party conference, where we didn't have a vote on Trident this year, or the year before, or the year before that, but that's another story. We did have the motion on AUKUS, the military pact between the United States, Australia and the United Kingdom, where overwhelmingly the unions did back the motion against AUKUS. And I should say, I was going to say this introducing Richard, who hasn't arrived. If you can take one action away in terms of pressurising MPs, that would be to ask your MP, whatever party they are, to sign early day motion 493 on AUKUS. It's a really easy way to do that, which is to go to the CND website and use the lobbying tool on the CND website, because the unions did do what we needed them to do on AUKUS at Labour Party conference. So please do encourage that. Just being told there's been another division bell in the House of Commons, which is probably why we don't have our parliamentarians. So I've done that announcement. I had another question, which was on the role of unions with regard to Labour Party policy, sometimes being resistant to an anti-Trident position because of the jobs argument, which Shelly has mentioned. And there are a number of reports available that have been prepared, particularly by the Nuclear Education Trust, but other organisations as well, about defence diversification. And I think the climate transition issue is actually an important way for us to think about the transition from one type of industrial strength to another, and a lot of the arguments do cross over. I do see a new speaker arriving, and I'm just going to try and get the heads up as to who that is. Brilliant. We do have Apsana Begum, who I'm going to introduce if she's ready. Sorry to bring her in so quickly. Apsana Begum is Member of Parliament for Poplar and Limehouse since 2019. Before that, she was on the Regional Executive Committee of the London Labour Party and is a former CLP secretary. So she really understands the Labour Party very well. And she's also one of the signatories to the early day motion that I mentioned earlier on AUKUS. But Apsana, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've had a busy time, but in the last few minutes, we're delighted you're here. Please do come in and say a few words.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and it's a pleasure to join you all this evening. I'm going to try and keep my contributions short because I know you've had some contributions already. But I wanted to start by sort of saying and addressing the fact that when I think about these issues, I think about the growing up in a community that opposed the war and facing the daily sort of racist and Islamophobic backlash. And also the fact that I'm of a Bangladeshi background, a country, the country Bangladesh that continues to suffer the consequences of imperialism, along with being extremely vulnerable to climate change. And it's been long clear to me that we must oppose war and destruction. And there's no doubt about it. I think I just want to sort of make that clear. There's no doubt about it that nuclear weapons cause catastrophic harm. They wreak devastation, they destroy, they kill, and have a long-term, radiation effects on our environment and the future of our planet. The use of nuclear bombs could disrupt the global climate, causing widespread famine and other disasters. And so I guess in a lot of ways, the question should always be sort of how can the deliberate and indiscriminate targeting of civilian populations be justified under any circumstance? We know a single nuclear bomb, detonated over a large city could kill on a frightening scale. And we know this because, when they were used twice in 1945 on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, civilians were incinerated in an instant or were subjected to horrendous deaths in the weeks and months following those attacks. So I can't, honestly think, in what circumstance that I would want to destroy a whole town or country or continent with just a push of a button. Why on earth, would anyone want this? And then what would happen if the world's countries armed with nuclear weapons engaged in direct, all-out confrontation? So this is why, this is also why nuclear weapons are also totally obsolete, as surely they can never be used. And rather than maintaining peace, as is often argued, they fuel fear and distrust. And when we talk about diplomacy, I mean, their diplomatic use is completely, tied up with imperialism. So what we do know is that wars and conflicts between states fueled by imperialism and competing foreign policy and or sort of economic interests are not embarked on for our safety. And the past decades have highlighted the connections between a country's foreign policy and people's safety at home. And I know that others will have covered this. And, the pact, the Australia, UK, US pact now represents a breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It will raise tensions, it will drive proliferation of ever more destructive weapons, and it essentially results in an arms race towards conflict, which risks nuclear escalation and ultimately annihilation. And I think we've got to see that pact in that context. The pact is, I think it's most fundamental to understand that the pact is signed when there is a pact like this is signed when there is an urgent multilateral global cooperation around, the threats that exist. But what will happen is it will divert vast resources needed to improve health and well-being, things that we've seen through the COVID crisis, and it won't result in stabilizing our climate, just as is being discussed at COP26. We need to imagine a world where, what would happen if the money was spent instead on health or education or in the fight against climate change. It could be used to create more jobs than the current or future nuclear weapon systems can provide, and we can invest in rapid decarbonization and a Green New Deal with public ownership at its heart. But just to go back, I'm conscious of time, but just to go back, about how I began, I grew up being inspired and motivated by not only the anti-war movement in East London, but global historic traditions. And I guess it seems fitting that just days after Black History Month ending, that I want to pay tribute to the great civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, who believed that nuclear disarmament was essential and inextricably linked to the quest for social justice and racial equality. When he was asked in 1957 in December about the use of nuclear weapons, he replied that hundreds of millions of people would be killed outright by the blast and heat and by the ionizing radiation produced by the instant explosion. If so-called dirty bombs were used, large areas would be made uninhabitable for extended periods of time. And additionally, hundreds of millions of people would probably be died from the delayed effects of local fallout radiation. And I think what he went on to say was that the principal objective of all nations must be total abolition of war, and war must be finally eliminated, or the whole of mankind will be plunged into the abyss of annihilation. And I think that was December 1957, and all these years later, these words are unfortunately as relevant as ever. That's why events like this are very important, and we must continue to campaign for peace, justice, human rights, and solidarity, for creating a future possibility rather than reaping mass destruction, for celebrating our world and human life and human achievement rather than fueling division and conflict, because we're not cannon fodder in a twisted global poker game, and our planet is not disposable, and no one, and I really mean no one, is simply expendable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apsana. That's absolutely brilliant. And you don't worry about what was said earlier. You absolutely covered things that needed to be said. I have got a message that Richard Burgon will be with us within seconds. And although we're slightly over time, I'm going to wait to see if he arrives. One of our speakers who didn't come back in that last round was Ronan from Tribune. I wondered if you wanted to respond to any of the points that have been made so far, Ronan.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. One of the things I think is most interesting is this question of what do we do around the strategy. I see Richard coming in, so I'll keep this nice and short. And I think it should be made very clear that there is a direct parallel between what's happening here and what's happening at COP26, which is that we talk an awful lot about the problems that the world faces when it comes to nuclear weapons, but actually it's not. The Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons passed the United Nations with an overwhelming global majority, as so many motions about justice do at the United Nations. And it is lacking the signatures only, really, of the world's most powerful nuclear states, the same states that make the Non-Proliferation Treaty a joke with their activities. The vast majority of the world, much like in climate change, is determined to do something serious about it, wants to see real action. It is up to us in the developed countries, in the countries which are nuclear states and also which have the greatest amount of power in this area, to force our governments to change. And if we can hold them to at least some degree of account of what the entire rest of the world believes, then we've got some chance, I think, of doing that. But it is about making it clear. The vast majority of people don't even know that there was a vote at the United Nations on that question. They don't know, certainly, the British government snubbed the vote. They don't know that the British government did it by claiming to support the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or that its own position on the NPT is a joke. So these conversations have to be had. We have to drag them out into the public sphere. And if we do that, I think there is a global movement around these questions that we can be part of. But it starts with holding our own governments accountable.
Thank you very much. That's more brilliant comments. Richard Burgon, hello.
Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I'm fine, and thank you for joining us at the end of the meeting. We did get the messages about what you're up to. Just to say, we've had a great meeting. There have been loads of very varied speeches on a range of matters, so you're not going to repeat anyone, I don't think. So, Richard, over to you.
Well, congratulations to Labour CND and to Young Labour for putting on this crucially important event. And I want to start tonight, which may surprise you, with a quote from Boris Johnson. Now, of course, the bloke's an idiot. And of course, much of what he says can be ignored. But this quote should be. It's a quote from his speech earlier this year at a time when he was launching Britain's new military strategy. It's a quote Boris Johnson made about the Royal Navy's new flagship aircraft carrier as it was set to make its maiden voyage to Asia. Here's what Boris Johnson said about that maiden voyage, and I quote, "On her flight deck will be a squadron of F-35 jets from the US Marine Corps. Among her escorts will be an American destroyer, showing how the British and American armed forces can operate hand in glove or plane on flight deck anywhere in the world." And I repeat that, anywhere in the world. Frightening. But this quote wasn't made in isolation. It actually reflects the new military strategy of the British states, or rather, it reflects the new military strategy of the United States, a military strategy that our government wants to tag along with, whatever harm it does and whatever risk it poses to our population. That military strategy is known in US circles as the pivot to Asia. What it really means is a greater military emphasis on relations with China. The United States is shifting its military focus from the wars in the Middle East of the last 20 years, which the Stop the War movement and the wider left did so much to oppose, and moving its military muscle to China. And every military decision, I would say, should now be seen in that light. The decision last year to increase the number of nuclear weapons by 40%, ripping up decades of gradual development and costing billions of pounds more, is to do with the pivot to China. That's the real reason, because nuclear weapons don't keep us safe. They're not the answer to the country's security, useless in dealing with the health crisis, useless in dealing with climate disaster, useless in dealing with terrorism and with cyber warfare. And the decision to boost military expenditure by 24 billion which Boris Johnson was keen to boast would ensure that we retain the biggest defence budget in Europe, second largest in NATO after the US, is about the pivot to China. And we saw this a few weeks back with the new AUKUS pact, the UK, US and Australia announcing a security pact in the Asia Pacific to confront China. And of course, the United States already has hundreds of military bases in Asia. All of this is part of a push for a new Cold War. So let's be clear, we should not be getting involved in any new Cold War opening up between the USA and China. A new Cold War poses a threat to peace. We all know, don't we? Cold wars can become hot wars and proxy wars. New Cold War also means vast resources being reallocated from public services to rising military budgets, and it won't stop at the extra funding that has gone in so far. We're literally cutting universal benefits for millions of people, universal credit for millions of people, at the same time as we hand a huge boost to the military. As Tony Benn said, he was right. If we can find the money to kill people, we can find the money to help people. A Cold War also means a world divided into various camps, which risks undermining the global cooperation on climate and public health and economic recovery the world needs now more than ever. All of this makes an even more dangerous world. China is already a nuclear state. If we're to spend billions more increasing the number of nuclear weapons, then what's to stop others also doing the same in a new global arms race? The world is changing. Countries that haven't been powerful for several hundred years are becoming more powerful. China, Brazil, India. This will require a new foreign policy based on a multilateral world and based upon diplomacy, where all regions of the world get to participate in shaping the world's future. We can't respond to this situation with ever greater military budgets and new nuclear weapons. So, yes, with Boris Johnson's new global vision, we've certainly got our work cut out. But I think that we can win this argument, just as we won the arguments about the dangers of war in the Middle East, wars that it gives me no pleasure to say the anti-war movement was proven entirely correct on. I don't think the public thinks that now's the time to be ramping up military spending. I don't think the public thinks that we're taking on China in some new Cold War. I don't think the public thinks we should be starting a new nuclear arms race. So I think we can be confident of winning this argument in our party and in the country and forcing the government off the dangerous and reckless path it is embarked upon. I'm really delighted that Labour CND and New Labour have organised this event, because we do need to step up the campaigning on the new dangers that we face. Now, a couple of years ago, when I stood in for Jeremy at the ITV leaders debate, I said that I was sick of politicians claiming that they would incinerate millions of people in order to get a few votes. I stand by that. Now, I'll continue to support the cause of CND, the cause for the abolition of nuclear weapons, but also the cause against the laws that increase the risks of those weapons being used. Now, more than ever, in our ever increasingly dangerous world, it's important that as a movement, we focus on international peace, we focus on international justice, we focus on making nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction a thing of the past. We move to a position where we're arguing as a movement for Britain to have an independent foreign policy based upon peace, cooperation, tackling climate change, helping refugees, and making a more just and better world. We shouldn't reduce our horizons as a movement from that. It's what our movement was founded to achieve.
Thank you, Richard, coming in at that point and giving us such a great speech. We have run over, but I think it was worth it. We've got a load of questions which we're not going to get to, but we'll have future meetings and I'm sure they will be covered. I will just say I want to thank all our speakers before I forget, because I think they've all been brilliant. And as I said before, Richard, they've all covered the topic in different ways, and it's been a really valuable and varied but coherent discussion. I'm supposed to make a few announcements, but I will be really quick. In addition to signing the early day motion that I mentioned earlier that was put down by Richard on AUKUS and signed by Apsana, there's also a model motion on AUKUS for your CLPs circulated by Labour CND. Please do propose that in your CLP or in your Young Labour group. And join CND. If you join CND and you're a Labour Party member, you're automatically in Labour CND. Do look out for our AGM next year. Do come to our future meetings. Do contact us if you want a speaker. And we hope the discussion continues from tonight. But I will end there so we don't go more than 15 minutes over. Thank you very much for attending and enjoy the rest of your evening.